remembering. It's something that's fun to do. I was reflecting on remembering about things when we were putting our Christmas tree up this year. We have so many ornaments on our Christmas tree. Usually I get tired of putting them up long before they're all done, and so my wife finishes. She has an amazing memory because so many of the ornaments, I'll say, "Where'd this come from?" And she can tell me. "Well, that was given to me by," and tells me when it happened. Now, I'm pretty good on a few of them. I know a number of them, like the easy ones, Baby's First Christmas. When it's got a picture of Allison, I know that's the Christmas of 85. But I'm not so good on many of them. There's one that we bought at Mark Twain's cave in Hannibal, Missouri. I remember that. I bought it for my wife. I remember it well. But there are others that I bought for her through the years that I'll say, "Where did we get this one?" And she'll remind me that I bought it for her. I say, "Oh, yeah." We have some Christmas tree ornaments that are just so absolutely ugly. And we put them on every year because they have precious memories that are associated with them. You have this ornament that's so ugly, it's a green styrofoam ball that someone took and glued shells to it. And it was my mother's mother, my grandmother. And every year we put this horribly ugly ornament on the tree, usually in the back. But it's precious because of the memories that are associated with it. There are objects that we have, items in our houses that we keep because of the memories that are attached. And because of the memories that are attached, emotions can also get attached to these items. And they can remind us of people and places we've been. And when we see them and we handle them, it seems like it transports us back in time. I have a few of those items that are precious to me that I'm going to share with you this morning. You think, why in the world is he showing a picture of a gun? Well, it's because this gun is something my father made for me when I was a little boy. It is the only object I have from my father when I was a little boy. Now, some of you parents are saying, "Pastor, I don't let my son play with guns." Oh, I'm sorry. I don't play with it anymore either. But I keep it because it's the only item that I have from my father. And so for me, it has a special memory. Although it's not as connected with emotion as is this shell. This shell is just an ordinary olive shell. Isn't that what they call these? An olive shell. It was my mother's. My mother had a lot of shells. Probably at the time of her death, several thousand shells that we had to sort through to get rid of or to give away. This is not the prettiest of them. This is not the most expensive of them. But this is a shell that my mother was given when she was 5 years old. It's the first shell she ever had in her life. It was given to her by a neighbor who lived down the street, who had gone to Florida, and when he came back, he brought this shell back, and she saw it, and she just loved it so much that he put this wire in it and made it into a watch fob, and he gave it to my mother when she was 5 years old. And before her death, she gave me this very precious shell. I'll never get rid of this shell. It's precious. It reminds me of my mother. And this not only reminds me of her, but it has a lot of emotion involved because of the deep relationship I had with my mother. Of course, you know I have to show an artifact. This is an oil lamp. It dates from the time of Jesus. It is about 2,000 years old, from Jerusalem area. It's very precious to me, not because it's the only one I have. Some of you have been in my office or in my library and my artifact room at home. I have a few more than this. This is just a couple shelves. I have about 200 ancient oil lamps. But this one is special above and beyond all the rest. To a large degree, I would sell almost anything in my collection. But this one I will keep forever. Why? It's the very first oil lamp I ever owned. And it was given to me by my wife and to her parents for Christmas. I remember receiving it. I had just taken a class in archaeology from Larry Garrity and had really gotten excited and interested in archaeology. I did a special project on ancient oil lamps. And that year at Christmas, I opened this. And I was really thrilled. I mean, really thrilled. It's very, very precious to me. And for the most part, these two others wouldn't be precious to anyone else, but other people could appreciate this as an object, but it has emotion involved because it came from my wife and her mom and dad. One last one I'll show you is, you recognize what it is? It's an Old Spice bottle. The Old Spice in here is less than it was. Yeah, it's about 37 years old. Very potent. Yeah, I've had this Old Spice for all those years. It's not precious, though, because of the Old Spice, although I used to wear it a lot because Candace liked the smell. But it's more precious because of what's wrapped around it. Do you remember Dymo tape, some of you? Dymo tape was those things where had the tape in it and you spell things out. About a week before Candace and I were getting married, we went to her apartment and moved her stuff out in readiness to move to Bering Springs, Michigan. And when I got to her apartment, there was this Dymo tape stretched across her front door. And I pulled it off and wrapped it around this bottle because I knew I always wanted to keep it. It says this: I am so glad this is not home anymore. But I am so glad you are here. I love you, KZ. Now, technically, she was still KS. And I've kept this on this Old Spice bottle for 37 years now. It's precious to me. It sits in my cabinet where my hair gel is and where my deodorant is, right there. I know that sounds really romantic, okay, but it sits there and reminds me. It's very emotional. It has emotional connections to it. It's precious because of my love for her and her love for me. And those last words, I love you, KZ. You see an item, it brings back memories. Jesus knew about this and humanity. Jesus created us to have these memories, to have these attachments. And so Jesus did something on the night in which he was betrayed, when he had the Lord's Supper. He did something for us to help us to be reminded of him. You know what happens here. Read with me in 1 Corinthians 11, 23 through 25. 1 Corinthians 11, 23 through 35. 23 through 25. It's a familiar passage to you, but I want to help you understand why Jesus did what he did. Verse 23, for I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus on the night when he was betrayed took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, he also took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. Jesus knew that we would have a tendency to forget. And so he gave us this special ceremony of the bread and the cup. They're actually on the table when he's gathered with his disciples in the upper room that night. They're celebrating Passover. These are common items that are on the table already. They're part of the ceremony that reflected back on the Exodus from Egypt. They already have significance in the ceremony, but Jesus takes them and singles them out and makes them special and connects them to himself. He says, when you eat this bread and you drink this cup, he says, remember me. Now, the word in Greek is a very interesting word. It's only used 4 times in the New Testament, and 3 of the 4 times had to do with communion. The word remembrance. It's the Greek word that I really like to say, so I'm going to tell you what it is. Anamnesis. It's a weird word because it has an M and an N together, which we never do in English, unless we run them together. But you say both of these, so it's anamnesis. Do any of you ever like the sound of a word and repeat it over and over and over in your brain just because it's fun to say it? Anybody do that but me? I know. Probably English majors do that too, right, Lori? It's just a fun word to say. Anamnesis. Anamnesis. It means remembrance. It means a recollection. So we could say, when you eat this bread and drink this cup, recall me, remember me. It's going to be like a trigger so that when you see it, you'll remember. You'll remember Jesus. Jesus knew we would be prone to forget, and so he gave us these symbols to help us to remember. He gave us the bread, telling us this is a symbol of his broken body. And so we break the bread. Sometimes people get into an argument. Other churches have gotten into arguments over what does it mean, this is my body. And so there have been communion wars waged over what does it mean, this is my body. Is it physically, body of Jesus physically present, which is the Roman Catholic view? But he says, this is my body which is broken for you. When you see this bread, remember me. It's a symbol. It's a symbol so that when we see the bread, we would think of Jesus. The cup, the wine. He gave it to us as a special significance. He says, when you see this cup, this wine, remember that it's like my blood that was spilled for you. When you see this grape juice, remember me. Have a pleasant memory of me. Now, the bread and the wine, the bread and the cup together, are what we call a sacrament. Now, we don't use the word sacrament in Adventism very often. It's a word that often reminds us of Catholicism. And so sacrament is not a word we use often, but it's a fine word. All it means is an ordinary item. The bread was ordinary bread, unleavened. The grape juice was ordinary grape juice. Average, ordinary, everyday things that because they're connected to something spiritual and holy, they take on a whole new meaning. So Jesus took the bread, he took the cup, and they acquired a meaning far beyond themselves so that those who have the eyes to see and those who have the heart to understand, when they eat and drink, they realize that it's something much greater than a snack. It's all about Jesus. Now, I think our early Christians understood this better than we do today. So every time you eat this bread and drink this cup, you do show the Lord's death until he comes. How often do we do it in Adventism? Once every 13 weeks. Do you ever wonder why we do it once every 13 weeks? It all has to do with the Methodists. The Methodists had a method for doing everything. That's why they got called Methodists, They had a method for doing everything, and so we do communion once a quarter. So therefore, once a quarter, we're forced to remember Jesus. Right? But what about in between? You may have heard me say this before. I could actually celebrate communion much more often than once a quarter. It would be okay for me. But since we have the foot washing, it kind of prolongs the service, and so many people wouldn't appreciate doing it. In actual fact, the early Christians celebrated communion more than once a quarter. If you turn with me to the book of Acts, the very first few weeks after Jesus has died and gone back to heaven, we see what their practice was. Acts chapter 2, verse 42. Acts 2:42 and verse 46. This is just a few days after the day of Pentecost. We're still in Acts 2, very early. In verse 42 it says, "And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to breaking of bread and the prayers." Verse 46 says, "And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with gladness and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people." It says they were from home to home breaking bread. Now, what does that mean, breaking bread? Some people say that it's potluck every day. They have everything in common. They're coming together. They're eating from house to house. Everyone's bringing something. My mother had an interesting word for potluck dinner. It wasn't fellowship dinner. Her description of potluck dinner was pitch in. Pitch in dinner. Everybody pitches a little bit in. That's what they were doing. They were going from house to house having pitch in dinners. Everybody pitched a little bit in. And so there was plenty of food. So is it, when they're breaking bread from house to house, is it just regular potluck? Meal together? Or there are some people that think the word breaking bread is a technical term for communion. So were they having potluck together every day? Or were they every day having the Lord's Supper as Jesus had shown them in the upper room? Which is it? And I say it's both. Every time they got together, they ate together, they fellowshiped together, and then at some point in time, they would recreate what Jesus had done in the upper room. It was hard for those who had gone through these things. It was hard for them to look at a loaf of bread and think sandwich. When they looked at a loaf of bread, they thought Jesus. Cool. Yeah, that's something they ate too. But Jesus said, "This loaf of bread is my body." And so the first thing they thought about was Jesus. When they drank grape juice, which was a common beverage of the day, it probably wasn't as good as Welch's. It was probably more watered down and maybe not quite as appetizing as it is for us. But when they drank grape juice, they didn't think about grape juice. They thought about the sacrifice of Jesus, the blood of Jesus. That's what they thought about. That's what first came to their mind. It seems to me the problem we face is that we've kind of compartmentalized communion for church. We come to church and we see some bread, or we see what we call it bread, but let's be honest, it looks like pie crust, right? It's unleavened and it looks like pie crust. We see it and we think communion, Lord's Supper. We see a loaf of bread at home, we think sub, sandwich, toast. We don't think about Jesus. We've kind of compartmentalized our lives. And I was thinking how wonderful it would be if we didn't compartmentalize our lives in that way, and we didn't see the Lord's Supper as just something we do once a quarter in church on Sabbath morning, something that many people decide not to come to for whatever reason. What would it be like if we didn't see the Lord's Supper as just something we did once a quarter? But what if we tried to make every meal the Lord's Supper? I'm not suggesting you should have bread and grape juice every meal, but remembering that Jesus is present in every loaf of bread we eat, in every bit of juice we drink. When we're together, He's with us. He's present. What if every loaf of bread reminded us of Jesus and made us thankful? What if every cup of grape juice reminded us of Jesus' sacrifice, and we felt again the joy of His salvation? It's not just every 13 weeks that He invites us to come to the table and partake. He invites us to fellowship with Him in a way that is not dissimilar to communion. He invites us to do that every single day. That would be my thought that I would like to ask you to think about this week. How can we make the communion service something that extends beyond what we do on Sabbath morning, and we can celebrate it every single day until we have communion again at church? Think about that. How can you do that? Make it all about Jesus. We're going to separate right now to go to our foot washing service. We have, for those of you who may be visitors, we practice an open communion. We're happy for you to share in our communion. The only thing we ask is if you love Jesus, you're welcome to share communion with us. And so we do celebrate the foot washing service, which may be a little different than some of our visitors may have seen. But we'll meet downstairs in the back room. There's a place for the men to meet. In the back end of the fellowship hall, there's a place for the women. The front end of the fellowship hall is a place for families and couples. And then if you have a problem getting up and down the steps, we have a room right here through this door that's set up for you so you don't have to worry about